Marx has had more impact on actual events as well as on the minds of men than any other intellectual in modern times. The unfortunate reason for this is not primarily the attraction of his concepts and methodology, though both have had a strong appeal to unrigorous minds, but the fact that his philosophy has been institutionalized in two of the world's largest countries, Russia and China, and their many satellites. In this sense, he resembles St. Augustine, whose writings were most widely read among church leaders from the 5th to the 13th centuries, therefore playing a predominant role in the shaping of medieval Christendom. But the influence of Marx has been even more direct, since the kind of personal dictatorship he envisioned for himself, as we shall see, was actually carried into effect with incalculable consequences for mankind by his three most important followers, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao Zedong, all of whom in this respect were faithful Marxists. Marx was a child of his time, the mid-19th century, and Marxism was a characteristic 19th century philosophy in that it claimed to be scientific. Scientific was Marx's strongest expression of approval, which he habitually used to distinguish himself from his many enemies. Unfortunately for posterity, his work was very unscientific. He felt that he had found an explanation of human behavior in history akin to Darwin's theory of evolution. The notion that Marxism is a science, in a way no other philosophy has ever been or could be, is implanted in the public doctrine of the states his followers founded, so that it colors the teaching of all subjects in their schools and universities. This has spilled over into the non-Marxist world for intellectuals, especially academics, and the identification of Marxism with massive physical authority has tempted many teachers to admit Marxist science to their own disciplines, especially such inexact or quasi-exact subjects as economics, sociology, history, and geography. The first thing we must ask about Marx, therefore, is, to what extent was he engaged in the pursuit of objective knowledge by the careful search for and evaluation of evidence? On the face of it, Marx's biography reveals him as primarily a scholar. He was descended on both sides from lines of academics. His father, Heinrich Marx, a lawyer, whose name originally was Herschel Halevi Marx, was the son of a rabbi and Talmudic scholar, descended from the famous rabbi Eleazar Halevi of Mainz, whose son Jehuda Mintz was head of the Talmudic school of Padua. Marx's mother, Henrietta Pressburg, was the daughter of a rabbi likewise descended from famous scholars and sages. Marx was born in Trier, then Prussian territory, on the 5th of May 1818, one of 9 children, but the only son to survive into middle age. The family was quintessentially bourgeois middle class, and it was rising in the world. The father was a liberal, and described himself as a real 18th century Frenchman. He read Voltaire and Rousseau inside out. Following a Prussian decree of 1816 which banned Jews from the higher ranks of law and medicine, he became a Protestant, and on the 26th of August 1824 had 6 of his children baptized. Marx was confirmed at 15, and for a time seems to have been a passionate Christian. Karl became a good classical scholar and later specialized in philosophy, in the prevailing Hegelian mode. He took a doctorate, but from Jena University, which had lower standards than Berlin. He never seems to have been quite good enough to get an academic post, however. In 1842 he became a journalist with the Rheinische Zeitung and edited it for 5 months until it was banned in 1843. Thereafter he wrote for the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher and other journals in Paris until his expulsion in 1848. Thereafter he became involved in organizing the Communist League and wrote its manifesto in 1848. After the failure of the revolution, he was forced to move and settle in London in 1849, this time for good. From the 1850s through the 1870s, he was again involved in revolutionary politics, running the International Working Men's Association. But most of his time in London until his death on the 14th March, 1883, that is some 35 years, was spent in the British Museum, milling about, finding material for a gigantic study of capital, and trying to get it into publishable shape. He saw 1 volume through the press in 1867, but the second and third were compiled from his notes by his colleague Friedrich Engels and published after his death. Marx then led a scholar's life. He once complained that he was a machine condemned to devour books, but in a deeper sense he was not really a scholar and not a scientist at all. He was not interested in finding the truth, but in proclaiming it. There were 3 strands in Marx: the poet, the journalist, and then the moralist. Each was important, and together they combined with his enormous will to make a formidable writer and seer. But there was nothing scientific about him. Indeed, in all matters, he was anti-scientific. Marx found his true form as a journalist, and in some ways he was a good one. Marx found planning, let alone writing, a major book not only difficult but impossible. Even Das Kapital is a series of essays glued together without any real form. But he was well suited to write short, sharp, opinionated reactions to events as they occurred. He believed, as his poetic imagination told him, that society was on the verge of collapse. So almost every big news story could be related to this general principle, giving his journalism a remarkable consistency. Journalistic aphorisms became the highlights of Marx's work. Its ballast was academic jargon. Over time, Marx became a failed academic, and as an embittered would-be Don, he wanted to astonish the world by founding a new philosophical school, which was also a plan of action designed to give him power. Hence his ambivalent attitude towards Hegel. Marx says in his preface to the second German edition of Kapital, "I frankly proclaimed myself as a disciple of that great thinker, and toyed with the use of Hegelian terminology when discussing the theory of value. But," he said, his own dialectical method was in direct opposition to Hegel's. For Hegel, the thought process is the creator of the real, whereas in my view, on the other hand, the ideal is nothing more than the material when it has been transposed and translated inside the human head. Hence, he argued, in Hegel's writings, dialectic stands on its head. Marx then sought academic fame by what he saw as his sensational discovery of the fatal flaw in Hegel's method, which enabled him to replace the entire Hegelian system with a new philosophy, indeed a super-philosophy which would make all existing philosophies outmoded. But he continued to accept that Hegel's dialectic was the key to human understanding, and he not only used it but remained its prisoner till the end of his life. But what has this to do with the politics and economics of the real world? Nothing whatsoever. Just as the origin of Marx's philosophy lay in a quasi-religious vision, so its elaboration was an exercise in academic jargonizing. What it needed, however, to set Marx's intellectual machinery into motion was a moral impulse, and this moral impulse eventually became politicized within the structure of his thought. Even when Marx goes on to politicize events, he still uses philosophical jargon. Quote, "Socialism cannot be brought into existence without revolution. When the organizing activity begins, when the soul, the thing in itself, appears, then socialism can toss aside all the political veils." Marx was a true Victorian. He underlined words as often as Queen Victoria herself in her letters, but his underlying does not actually help much to convey his meaning, which remains sunk in the obscurity of the concepts of German academic philosophy. Marx often resorted to habitual giganticism, stressing the global nature of the process he was describing, but this too was cumbered by the jargon. Thus, the proletariat can only exist world historically, just as communism in its actions can only have world historical existence, or communism is empirically only possible as the act of the ruling people all at once and simultaneously, which presupposes the universal development of productive power and the world commerce which depends on it. Obscure commentaries, to be sure. However, even when Marx's meaning is clear, his statements do not necessarily have any validity. They are no more than obiter dicta of a moral philosopher. Some of the sentences I've quoted above would sound equally plausible or implausible if they were altered to say the opposite. Where then were the facts, the evidence from the real world, to turn these prophetic utterances of a moral philosopher, quasi-religionist, these revelations, into a science? Marx always had an ambivalent attitude to facts, as he had to Hegel's philosophy. On the one hand, he spent entire decades of his life amassing facts, which accumulated in over 100 enormous notebooks. But these were the facts to be found in libraries, blue book facts. The kind of facts which did not interest Marx were the facts to be discovered by examining the world and the people who live in it, with his own eyes and ears. He was totally and incorrigibly desk-bound. Nothing on earth would get him out of a library and the study. His interest in poverty and exploitation went back to the autumn of 1842, when he was just 24 and wrote a series of articles on the laws governing the right of local peasants to gather wood. According to Engels, Marx told him it was his study of the law concerning the theft of wood and his investigation of the Moselle peasantry which turned his attention from mere politics to economic conditions and thus to socialism. But there is no evidence that Marx actually talked to these peasants or looked at the conditions on the spot. Again, in 1844, he wrote for the financial weekly Vorwärts, or Forward, on an article on the plight of the Silesian weavers. But he never went to Silesia, or, for as far as we know, ever talked to a weaver of any description. It would have been very uncharacteristic of him if he had. Marx wrote about finance and industry all his life, but he knew only two people connected with financial and industrial processes. One was his uncle in Holland, Leon Philips, a successful businessman who created what eventually became the vast Philips Electric Company. Uncle Philip's views on the whole capitalist process would have been well informed and interesting had Marx troubled to explore them, but he only once consulted him on a technical matter of high finance, and though he visited Phillips 4 times, these concerned purely personal matters of family loans. The other knowledgeable man was Engels himself, but Marx declined Engels' invitation to accompany him on a visit to a cotton mill, and so far as we know, Marx never set foot in a mill, factory, mine, or other industrial workplace in the whole of his life. What is even more striking is Marx's hostility to fellow revolutionaries, and in particular working-class revolutionaries who had experience, that is, working men who had become politically conscious. He met such people for the first time only in 1845, when he paid a brief visit to London and attended a meeting of the German Workers' Education Society, and he did not like what he saw. These men were mostly skilled workers, watchmakers, printers, shoemakers. Their leader was a forester. They were self-educated, disciplined, solemn, well-mannered, very anti-bohemian and anti-liberal, anxious to transform society but moderate, without the practical steps to this end. They did not share Marx's apocalyptic visions, and above all, they did not speak in his academic jargon. He viewed them with contempt. Revolutionary cannon fodder. Marx always preferred to associate with middle-class intellectuals like himself, champagne socialists. When he and Engels created the Communist League, and again when they formed the International, Marx made sure that working-class socialists were eliminated from the positions of influence and sat on committees merely as statutory proles. His motive was partly intellectual snobbery, partly that men with actual experience of factory conditions tended to be anti-violence and in favor of modest, progressive improvements. They were knowledgeably skeptical about the apocalyptic revolution he claimed was not only necessary but inevitable. Some of Marx's most venomous assaults were directed against men of this type. Strangely how cultural Marxism today does the same. Thus, in March 1846, he subjected William Weitling to a kind of trial before a meeting of the Communist League in Brussels. Weitling was the poor illegitimate son of a laundress who never knew his father's name, a tailor's apprentice who by sheer hard work and self-education had won himself a large following among German workers. The object of the trial was to insist on correctness of doctrine, and to put down any uppity working-class type who lacked the philosophical training Marx thought was essential. Marx's attack on Weitling was extraordinarily aggressive. He was guilty, said Marx, of conducting an agitation without doctrine. This was all very well in barbarous Russia, where you can build up successful unions with stupid young men and apostles, but in a civilized country like Germany, you must realize that nothing can be achieved without our doctrine." End quote. And further to this, he said, "If you attempt to influence the workers, especially the German workers, without a body of doctrine and clear scientific ideas, then you are merely playing an empty and unscrupulous game of propaganda, leading inevitably to the setting up on the one hand of an inspired apostle, and, on the other, of open-mouthed donkeys listening to him." Weitling replied he had not become a socialist to learn about doctrines manufactured in a study. He spoke for actual working men and would not submit to the views of mere theoreticians who were remote from the suffering world of real labor. This, said an eyewitness, so enraged Marx that he struck his fist on the table so violently that the lamp shook. Jumping to his feet, he shouted, "Ignorance has never helped anybody yet." The meeting ended with Marx still striding up and down the room in violent rage. This became the pattern for further assaults, both on socialists of working-class origin and on any leaders who had secured a large following of working men by preaching practical solutions to actual problems of work and wages, rather than doctrinaire revolution. Marx, then, was unwilling either to investigate working conditions in industry himself, or to learn from intelligent working men who had experienced them. Why should he? In all essentials, using the Hegelian dialectic, he had reached his conclusions about the fate of humanity by the late 1840s. All that remained was to find the facts to substantiate them, and these could be garnered from newspaper reports, government blue books, and evidence collected by earlier writers. And all this material could be found in libraries. In a sense, then, the facts are not central to Marx's work. They are ancillary, buttressing conclusions already reached independently of them. Capital, the monument around which his life as a scholar revolved, should be seen then not as a scientific investigation of the nature of the economic process it purported to describe, but as an exercise in moral philosophy, a tract comparable to those of Carlyle or Ruskin. It is a huge and often incoherent sermon, an attack on the industrial process and the principle of ownership by a man who had conceived a powerful but essential irrational hatred for them. Curiously enough, it does not have a central argument which acts as an organizing principle. Marx originally, in 1857, conceived the work as consisting of 6 volumes, but the methodical self-discipline needed to carry through such a plan proved beyond his power. In short, all the first part of Marx's scientific examination of working conditions under capitalism in the mid-1860s is based upon a single work, Friedrich Engels' Condition of the Working Class in England, published a number of years before. The truth is, even the most superficial inquiry into Marx's use of evidence forces one to treat with skepticism everything he wrote which relies on factual data. He simply cannot ever be trusted. The whole of the key Chapter 8 of Capital is a deliberate and systematic falsification to prove a thesis which an objective examination of the facts shows was untenable. His crimes against the truth fall under 4 heads. First, he uses out-of-date material because up-to-date material does not support his case. Second, he selects certain industries where conditions were particularly bad as typical of capitalism. This cheat was particularly important to Marx because without it he could not really have had Chapter 8 at all. His thesis was that capitalism produces ever-worsening conditions. The more capital employed, the more badly the workers had to be treated to secure adequate returns. The evidence he quotes at length to justify it comes almost entirely from small, inefficient, undercapitalized firms in archaic industries, which in most cases were pre-capitalist, i.e. pottery, dressmaking, blacksmiths, baking, matchmakers, wallpaper, and lace, for instance. Thirdly, using reports of the factory inspectorate, Marx quotes examples of bad conditions and ill-treatment of workers as though they were the inevitable norm of the system. In fact, these were the responsibility of what the inspectors themselves called the fraudulent mill owner, whom they were appointed to detect and prosecute, and who was thus in the process of being eliminated anyway. Fourthly, the fact that Marx's main evidence came from this source, the inspectorate, betrays his biggest cheat of all. It was his thesis that capitalism was by its nature incorrigible, and further, that in the miseries it inflicted on the workers, the bourgeois state was in fact its associate, since the state, he wrote, is an executive committee for managing the affairs of the governing class as a whole. But if it were true, Parliament would never have passed the Factory Acts, nor the state enforced them. Virtually all of Marx's facts, selectively deployed and sometimes falsified as they were, came from the efforts of the state to improve conditions which necessarily involved exposing and punishing those responsible for bad ones. If Marx then, though in appearance a scholar, was not motivated by a love of truth, what was the energizing force in his life? To discover this, we have to look much more closely at his personal character. It is a fact, and in some ways a melancholy fact, that massive works of the intellect do not spring from the abstract workings of the brain and the imagination. They are deeply rooted in the personality. Marx is an outstanding example of this principle. We have already considered the presentation of his philosophy as the amalgam of his poetic vision, his journalistic skill, and his academicism, but it can be also shown that its actual content can be related to 4 aspects of his character: his taste for violence, his appetite for power, his inability to handle money, and above all, his tendency to exploit those around him. The undertone of violence always present in Marxism and constantly exhibited by the actual behavior of Marxist regimes was a projection of the man himself. Marx lived his life in an atmosphere of extreme verbal violence, periodically exploding into violent rows and sometimes physical assault. Marx's family quarrels were almost the first thing his future wife, Jennifer von Westphalen, noticed about him. At Bonn University, the police arrested him for possessing a pistol, and he was very nearly sent down. The university archives show he engaged in student warfare, fought a duel, and got a gash on his left eye. His rows within the family darkened his father's last years and led eventually to a total breach with his mother. One of his wife's earliest surviving letters reads, "Please do not write with so much rancor and irritation." And it is clear that many of his incessant rows arose from the violent expressions he was prone to use in writing, and still more in speech, the latter often aggravated by alcohol. Marx drank daily, and often heavily, sometimes engaging in serious drinking bouts. Part of his trouble was that, from his mid-20s, Marx was always an exile living almost exclusively in expatriate, mainly German communities in foreign cities. He rarely sought acquaintances outside them and never tried to integrate himself. Moreover, the expatriates with whom he always associated were themselves a very narrow group interested wholly in revolutionary politics. This in itself helps to explain Marx's tunnel vision of life, and it would be difficult to imagine a social background more likely to encourage his quarrelsome nature, for such circles are notorious for their ferocious disputes. According to his wife, the rows were perpetual. In Paris, his editorial meetings in the Rue de Moulins had to be held behind closed windows, so that people outside could not hear the endless shouting. These rows were not aimless, however. Marx quarreled with everyone with whom he associated, from Bruno Bauer onwards, unless he succeeded in dominating them completely. As a result, there were many descriptions, mainly hostile, of the furious Marx in action. One associate of Marx's, a man by the name of KARL MARX, said that he had a habit of saying, "I will annihilate you." Perhaps not strangely, much of Marx's time was spent in collecting elaborate dossiers about his political rivals and enemies, which he did not scruple to feed to the police if he thought it would serve his turn. The big public rows, as for instance at the meeting of the International at The Hague in 1872, adumbrated the Règlement des Comptes of Soviet Russia. There is nothing in the Stalinist epoch which is not distantly prefigured in Marx's behavior there. Occasionally blood was indeed spilt. Marx was so abusive during his row with August von Willich in 1850 that the latter challenged him to a duel. Marx, though a former duelist, said he would not engage in the frolics of Prussian officers, but he made no attempt to stop his young assistant, Konrad Schramm, from taking his place, though Schramm had never used a pistol in his life, and Willich was an excellent shot. Schramm was wounded badly. How Marx actually saw the morality of his actions, whether distorting truth or encouraging violence, it is impossible to say. In one sense, he was a strongly moral person. He was filled with a burning desire to create a better world. Yet he ridiculed morality in the German ideology. He argued that it was unscientific and could be an obstacle to revolution. He seems to have thought it would be dispensed with the result of a quasi-metaphysical change in human behavior that the advent of communism would bring about. Like many self-centered individuals, he tended to think that moral laws did not apply to himself, or rather to identify his interests with morality as such. Certainly he came to see the interests of the proletariat and the fulfillment of his views as coextensive. In his testimony about Marx's political aims and behavior, it is notable how often the word dictator crops up. Anikoff called him the personification of a democratic dictator. An unusually intelligent Prussian police agent who reported on him in London noted, "The dominating trait of his character is an unlimited ambition and love for power. He is an absolute ruler of his party. He does everything on his own and gives orders on his own responsibility and will endure no contradiction." Von Teschau, who once managed to get Marx drunk and to pour forth his soul, gives a brilliant pen portrait of him. Quote, "He was a man of outstanding personality, with a rare intellectual superiority, and if his heart had matched his intellect and he had possessed as much love as hate, I would have gone through fire for him. But he is lacking in nobility of soul. I am convinced that a most dangerous personal ambition has eaten away all the good in him. The acquisition of personal power is the aim of all his endeavors." And Michael Bakunian's final judgment on Marx struck the same note. Quote, "Marx does not believe in God, but he believes much in himself and makes everyone serve himself. His heart is not full of love but of bitterness, and he has very little sympathy for the human race." Marx's habitual anger, his dictatorial habits, and his bitterness reflected no doubt his justified consciousness of great powers and his intense frustration at his inability to exercise them more effectively. As a young man he led a bohemian, often idle and dissolute life. In early middle age he still found it difficult to work sensibly and systematically, often sitting up all night talking, then lying half asleep on the sofa for most of the day. In late middle age he kept more regular hours, but he never became self-disciplined about work. Yet he resented the smallest criticism. It was one of the characteristics he shared with Rousseau, that he tended to quarrel with friends and benefactors, especially if they gave him good advice. His angry egoism had physical as well as psychological roots. He led a peculiarly unhealthy life, took very little exercise, ate highly spiced foods and often in large quantities, smoked heavily, drank a lot, and as a result had constant trouble with his liver. He took 1 or 2 baths every year and hardly washed his hands at all. This, plus his unsuitable diet, may explain the veritable plague of boils from which he suffered for a quarter of a century. They increased his natural irritability and seemed to be at their worst while he was writing Capital. "Whatever happens," he wrote grimly to Engels, "I hope the bourgeoisie, as long as they exist, will have cause to remember my carbuncles." The boils varied in numbers and intensity, but at one time or another they appeared on all parts of his body, including his cheeks, the bridge of his nose, his bottom, lower extremities, and penis. Still more central to his anger and frustration, and lying perhaps at the very roots of his hatred for the capitalist system, was his grotesque incompetence in handling money. As a young man, it drove him into the hands of moneylenders at high rates of interest, and a passionate hatred of usury was the real emotional dynamic of his whole moral philosophy. These troubles began at university and lasted his entire life. They rose from an essentially childish attitude. Marx borrowed money heedlessly, spent it, then was invariably astounded and angered when the heavily discounted bills plus interest became due. He saw the charging of interest, essential as it is to any system based on capital, as a crime against humanity and at the root of the exploitation of man by man, which his entire system was designed to eliminate. That was in general terms. But in the particular context of his own case, he responded to his difficulties by himself exploiting anyone within reach, and in the first place his own family. Money dominates his family correspondence. The last letter from his father, written in February of 1838, when he was already dying, reiterates his complaint that Marx was indifferent to his family, except for the purpose of getting their help, and complains, "You are now in the 4th month of your law course, and you have already spent 280 thalers. I have not earned so much throughout the entire winter." 3 months later, he was dead. Marx did not trouble to attend his funeral. Instead, he started putting pressure on his mother. He had already adopted a pattern of living off loans from friends and gouging periodic sums from the family. He argued that the family was quite rich and had a duty to support him in his important work. Apart from his intermittent journalism, the purpose of which was political rather than to earn money, Marx never seriously attempted to get a real job, though he once in London applied for a post as a railway clerk, being turned down on the grounds that his handwriting was too poor. Marx's unwillingness to pursue a career seems to have been the main reason why his family was unsympathetic to his pleas for handouts. His mother not only refused to pay his debts, believing he would then simply contract more, but eventually cut him off completely. Thereafter, their relations were minimal. In one last letter to him, she would write, "I wish you would accumulate capital instead of just writing about it." All the same, one way or another, Marx got considerable sums of money by inheritance. His father's death brought him 6,000 gold francs, some of which he spent on arming Belgian workmen. His mother's death in 1856 brought him less than he expected, but this was because he had anticipated the legacy by borrowing from his uncle Philips. He also received a substantial sum from the estate of Wilhelm Woltte in 1864. Other sums came in through his wife and her family. She also brought with her a part of her wedding portion, a silver dinner service with the coat of arms of her Argyll ancestors. Between them they received enough money, sensibly invested, to provide a competence, and at no point did their actual income fall below £200 a year, 3 times the average wage of a skilled workman. But neither Marx himself nor his wife had any interest in money except to spend it. Legacies and loans alike went in dribs and drabs, and they were never a penny better off permanently. Indeed, they were always in debt, and often seriously, and the silver dinner service regularly went to the pawnbrokers along with much else. At one point, Marx alone was in a position to leave the house retaining 1 pair of trousers. But of course the principal victims of Marx's improvidence and unwillingness to work were his own household, his wife above all. Jennifer Marx is one of the tragic, pitiful figures of socialist history. She had the clear Scottish colouring, pale skin, green eyes and auburn hair of her paternal grandmother, descended from the 2nd Earl of Argyll. She was a beauty, and Marx loved her, and she loved him passionately at first. It took many years of bitterness for her love to die, however. How could an egoist like Marx inspire such affection? He was proud of his wife's noble Scottish descent, and her position as the daughter of a baron and senior official in the Prussian government. On printed invitations to a ball which she issued in London in the 1860s, they referred to her as "Née von Westphalen," or Westphalen. Marx leaned heavily on his wife all throughout their marriage, and after her death in 1881, he faded rapidly himself, doing no work, taking the cure at various European spas, or traveling to Algiers, Monte Carlo, and Switzerland in search of sun or pure air. In December of 1882, he exulted at his growing influence in Russia. "Nowhere is my success more delightful," he said. Destructive to the end, he boasted that it gives me the satisfaction that I damage a power which, next to England, is the true bulwark of the old European society. 3 months later, he died in his dressing gown, sitting next to a fire. One of his daughters, Jennifer, had died a few weeks before. The lives of the other 2 daughters were also tragic. Eleanor, heartbroken by her husband's conduct, took an overdose of opium in 1898, possibly in a suicide pact from which he wriggled out. 13 years later, his daughter Laura and her husband also agreed to a suicide pact, and both carried it through. There was, however, one curious obscure survivor of this tragic family, the product of Marx's most bizarre act of personal exploitation. In all his researches into the iniquities of British capitalists, he came across many instances of low-paid workers, but he never succeeded in unearthing one who was paid literally no wages at all. Yet such a worker did exist in his own household. Carrying the picnic basket and other impedimenta was a stumpy female figure. This was Helen de Muth, known in the family as Lenchen. Born in 1823 of peasant stock, she had joined the von Westphalen family at the age of 8 as a nursery maid. She got her keep but was paid nothing. In 1845, the Baroness, who felt sorrow and anxiety for her married daughter, gave Lenchen, then 22, to Jennifer Marx to ease her lot. She remained in the Marx family until her death in 1890. Eleanor called her the most tender of beings to others, while throughout her life a stoic to herself. And as would be expected, Lenchen had a child by Karl. This child was born at the Soho address on 28 Dean Street on the 23rd of June 1851. It was a son registered as Henry Frederick de Muth. Marx refused to acknowledge his responsibility then or ever, and flatly denied the rumors that he was the father. This woman, then, was the only member of the working class that Marx ever knew at all, his one real contact with the proletariat. She helped raise his daughters, washed his breeches and darned his clothes, and never received a farthing for this. Their illegitimate son, Frederick, was brought up as a working-class lad, and in 1888, when he was just 36, he got his coveted certificate as a qualified engineer and fitter. He spent virtually all of his life in King's Cross and Hackney, and was a regular member of the Engineers' Union. But Karl Marx never knew him. They met only once, presumably when Frederick was coming up the outside steps from the kitchen, and he had no idea then that the revolutionary philosopher, his father, was the man pouring tea in the kitchen. He died in East London in January of 1929, by which time Marx's vision of the dictatorship of the proletariat had taken concrete and terrifying shape, and Stalin, the ruler who achieved the absolute power for which Marx had yearned, was just beginning his catastrophic assault on the Russian people.